Welcome to the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. I'm JD Wilson, and today on the show, we've got occupational therapist Marti Smith. You may know her from her book, The Connected Therapist, but Marti is a brilliant occupational therapist, and she joins us to talk about all kinds of different things, namely her career and how she got into this work, but also the work that she's done in collaboration with the Karyn Purvis Institute of Child Development at TCU, with TBRI practitioner training and lots more. Marti talks to us about a ton of stuff, and you're going to love her. She has long been an admired person on our list at ETC and a friend of the program. And so we're just so grateful to have her on today and thankful that she was willing to come on with us. And so without any further ado, here we go, our interview with Marti Smith. Well, we are here today with Marti Smith, and Marti is an occupational therapist amongst lots of other things we'll get into in just a second, and fresh off a baby visit today. And so she's super happy. And so this is our scheme was to catch her right at this moment, to talk with her today. But, Marti, thank you for being here. And, I think maybe the best place for us to start would just be to give kind of our listeners a framework for your work. And then we'll talk about the book that you've written and some of your work that you're doing right now. But, if you don't mind just giving people a brief background on kind of who you are and how you got started with this work.
Yeah, for sure. So I am an occupational therapist, and I started my career in the schools and worked a lot with children in several different counties. I was in rural Indiana, so I had a pretty big caseload, and a lot of the children on my caseload had the diagnosis of autism, or they had difficulty with handwriting. And so if I was going to survive in that environment, I needed to figure those things out. And so then I took every sensory processing class I could find and really sunk into the sensory systems and also handwriting as well. So motor planning and sensory is where I had a lot of my background. And then fast forward 10 years, and I ended up meeting this guy on eHarmony, and he didn't want to live in Indiana. And so he moved me to Texas. And so this Midwest Hoosier found herself, eating an avocado for the first time, and lots of new things that Rob brought to my life. And one of them was Dr. Bruce Perry. And so he was actually working with Dr. Perry on the metric, the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And he was the computer guy behind the scenes. And so as Rob and Dr. Perry would talk about this thing that they were doing, because Rob was just doing it as a side job. It wasn't even his real job. And I remember very clearly a friend of mine, Julie Corey, who is a friend of yours as well, I believe. She runs Fostering Hope here in Austin. She had some children who she had adopted, and she was like, "Hey, will you look at my kids for me? Help me out with them from an OT perspective. Like, I like you as a person, and we're looking to find a compassionate OT that understands, trauma and adoption." And I was like, "Well, I don't really understand those things, but I do understand the sensory system." And so started working with her, and Bruce happened to call Rob that night. And so Rob came in and was talking to me. She's like, "Wait, Bruce Perry's calling your house?" And I'm like, "I know, how annoying, right? It's after hours." And she's like, "You don't even know who this is." And I was like, "I don't know who this is. It's some guy who's talking to my husband." So anyway, Julie was like, "Oh, you need to meet this guy, and you two could do some really, cool things." So then that kind of got Rob on board, and Rob started talking to Dr. Perry. And eventually I found myself working with the Child Trauma Academy, which has now been rebranded and changed into the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And so I've been with them since 2008 or 2009, for quite some time. And as I met him, I was like, "Oh, now I'm seeing it." And what was interesting was he sent me all of his information and said, "Here's some videos to watch if you want to know what I'm doing." And And as I'm watching these videos, I was just wrecked because I realized how many things I was doing with my own children. And we had a lot of birth trauma with my oldest, and I had no idea that would affect her development. And so she had some sensory things coming out. And I remember just thinking, "Oh my gosh, I mean, she's almost 4. And this is brand new. Like, we're upper middle class white people. Like we didn't have trauma, and to view it differently, then I was invested. Right. And so I wanted to change my own family and change my own ways. And then through Julie, Dr. Purvis found out that I was working with Dr. Perry. And so she asked me then to join TBRI. And so I've been with the Institute, since 2009, maybe 2010. Okay. They did a big thing where they had a bunch of people from Austin got together, and they had judges and teachers and like all these different people. And that's where I met Robin Goebel, I know is a friend of yours as well. Yeah. And so Robin and I think we're sitting at the same table. And then Robin would start sending me her clients. And then I, of course, I was like, I'll take them, but I don't know what to do. Like, and Robin was like, I got the psychology part. I just need the sensory systems. And I was like, okay, I'm good with that. I'm really good with the sensory system. And so, and then I absolutely fell in love with these kids and started just reading more about trauma and, doing more trauma things. And at the time, OTs weren't really in the trauma world actively. Right. There were probably 10 of us, but we weren't even connected. I didn't even know who these people were. And I've since found a lot of them, but and then it's kind of exploded from there. We now have like trauma-informed OT groups. We just did the practitioner training in Memphis. I get to sometimes tag along with the sensory stuff because I did help develop a lot of the sensory stuff for TBRI. And while I was there were several OTs, and I believe even some from y'all's place were there too. And that was just, my heart is just leaping because I'm like, OTs are coming to the table. And I'm so excited because we do have such a valuable like we're a related service, and that means that we're part of the family, but I always say we're like the fun uncle, and like bring us to the table. We're really fun and we get it. And we're removed enough that we're not all in your business like the aunt would be, but we're that uncle that kind of sits back and looks at things and is like, well, let me take him outside and swing him a little bit. And then come back and everybody's in a good mood. So, yeah.
Well, and I think, so I would say one of the things I would love for you to differentiate, one of my wife's best friends is an OT, and I did not think it was a joke, but I was meeting her for the first time. I was like, oh, so do you work in like, getting folks jobs and like helping people with that kind of stuff? And she was like, no. And she was so offended by that question. And I mean, we are great friends, but she was like sighed and she was like, all right, so what do we do? So it's never dawned on me, I think, that there was a separation between the general population of OTs who are rolling through programs across the country and going out into the workforce, and those who are trauma informed. So would you kind of explain some of those differentiations? Like what were some of the things that you were learning when it came to trauma and OT that were eye openers for you?
Yeah. Well, and to even back up a little bit further, occupational therapy is a generalist kind of degree. It's a master's degree. And now they're even wanting to make it a doctorate degree. But one of my best friends, absolute best friends, we see each other all the time. She's a hand therapist. We have the exact same degree. And she spends her day is spent in surgeries with orthopedic surgeons. And she literally goes in and starts rehabbing the hand as soon as it's stitched back together. Okay. And then she carries those patients on. And so she works in a hospital, and her life is incredibly different than mine. And when I graduated from OT school, like I said, I went into the school system. So I was working a lot with adapting things, making sure that the wheelchairs could get into the bathrooms, making sure they had access to gym, making sure that they could access the lunchrooms, like a lot of accessibility, a lot of organization, making sure that they had the right accommodations for their schooling. And then on the weekends, because I had a lot of flexibility being on a school schedule, I worked in a nursing home, and I worked with people who had fallen and they had a broken hip, or they'd had a stroke, or, so being an OT, it's almost like a nursing degree. You could do anything with it. And it's a wonderful degree for that very reason, is you can be very specific. Debbie is very specific with her job, and, she has protocols for everything. In the school system, there's very few protocols. Like I just need to get this kid to be able to, focus in the classroom. And so for even a pediatric OT, some of them can work with more of the physical realm of cerebral palsy, or they might work specifically with Down syndrome, or they might, so we all kind of pigeonhole when we get out of school. And even though I worked in the sensory processing and I did do a lot of OT with a lot of kids, and I worked at an outpatient clinic when I first moved to Austin, I actually worked at a school that was geared towards children with a diagnosis of autism. So you had to have that diagnosis to get into the school. And so I did a lot of sensory things with them. But what I didn't understand, and what wrecked me from the Dr. Perry work, and also, a little bit of Dr. Purvis, but a lot of her information came from him too, was the attachment. And we watched videos on Bobley, and we learned about attachment in OT school as part of our psychology stuff. And we have a minor in psychology, so we get psychology. But what I didn't understand was how, when you have adversity early, it really impacts the brain development. And so a lot of what I was listening to with Dr. Perry was, oh, of course, and he talks about the neurosequential model and how you have to go back and rehab what was missed before you move forward. Well, that's stroke rehab. So as an OT, I was like, oh, Dr.
Had a framework for that. Yeah.
I've already got synapses that know that stuff, like this is not new. And I knew a lot of the stuff that he was teaching. It wasn't new to me, but the lens of which he looked through it, which I would say was more compassionate, because in the rehab setting, it's a lot of meeting your goals and making insurance happy and ticking the boxes, and, making the kid do 50,000 squats, making it fun if you can, but, we're going to kick this ball ad nauseum until you learn how to kick it in a net, and really opening up my eyes of, if you don't have a relationship to kick that ball, you're really missing out on some really good therapeutic process. And understanding as well, I heard it from Stuart Avalon. I think it actually came from Ross Green or somebody, but the children do well when they can. And so as a pediatric OT, I was always like, well, if they can't, I just need to rehab them. Right. And so I was doing a lot of activity analysis and just very behavioral based, I guess I would say as well. And now with this more connection and relationship based, I'm really pulling back and saying, oh, like it matters if the kid wants to kick the ball into the net, and if I can get a relationship with them first. And, that whole regulate, relate, reason, empower, connect, correct. I need to empower and regulate. And I never really thought of those terms. And I probably moved a little bit too fast through that continuum in the past. And so as new OTs are coming out, and, one of the things I'm very passionate about is to help them understand that, leaning into Dr. Perry's latest book of, what happened to you, it's so important. Yeah. And not only for the kid, but to listen to what happened to the caregiver, and to understand the caregiver's capacity, and to have a more family-based approach to my work, a more compassionate and a more like matching the expectations a little bit more. So instead of just looking at my assessments and saying, oh, by the age of 10, he should be able to do X, Y, Z, turning around and going, I can't really expect this 10-year-old to do this, because this 10-year-old has been in therapy when they were supposed to be learning math skills. So of course the math skills are going to be lagging. And I need to go back and just be more patient with the process, I think. And we really talk about, what does trauma informed mean, and in the OT community, even we're trying to, kind of fuss that out. And a lot of it is really looking at the sensory system through the lens of the safety, the felt safety in the sensory systems. And, does this child feel safe in my care? And does the family feel safe in my care? And do I really, truly have compassion and a little bit more patience for the journey that they're on, and the awareness that it's more of a journey than it is a rehab process.
Yeah. So as you're starting to learn that and you're starting to put it into practice, did you have any early, not light bulb, but early celebration, like, oh my gosh, look at this. Like, this is happening now. Like, this is really cool. What were some of those early wins like for you when you started integrating all that knowledge into your practice with your clients?
Well, I felt better, I think. It wasn't as exhausting for one, and because when you're trying to put those square pegs in the round holes, like, it's exhausting. and I feel like the aha moments for me were when the parents would sit on my couch, because like in the waiting room or whatever, and I could see the parents' breath support improve. And like the parents were taking a breath. And when the parents took a breath, when I invited them into the space with me, then I had more carryover. And so really my kids are getting better actually faster. Like I talk about, it's a journey and it's a process, but I'm actually getting to the finish line faster than I was when it was, okay, mom, you can run over to Target. You've got an hour, and come back and here's your kid. Now when mom comes back with me or grandma or grandpa or auntie or uncle, whoever's with them, then the next week I'm like, oh, they've actually made big progress because they've been able to do these things. And even, I know this sounds so ridiculous and self-centered and everything, but for me, last night I was told by one of my clients that their kid was at school, and they said, the teacher was like, "Who's your best friend?" And the guy, he mentioned someone else as well, and then he was like, "Oh wait, or is it Miss Marti?" And I was
that's awesome.
Oh my gosh, like to me, that's just absolutely amazing. Like it's just oh yes, like I want to be on their team. And obviously I want them to have other friends. I don't want to be anybody's best friend, 9. But they're thinking about the things that they did, and they're integrating more of the therapy session, and little things like a parent tells me, oh, we finally were able to, put clothes on the other day.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's amazing, because I would work on clothing things for months before. And once we really get to the heart of the clothing issue and the relationship behind it, then it's just so different.
Okay. So for you, how did you get from that moment to then saying, I'm writing a book, dadgummit, I'm going to put this into writing, and I'm going
well, that's a whole other story. That could be a whole podcast. So I didn't want to write that book. That was not my idea. Okay. And actually I remember laying in bed one night, and I thought, when I first started reading Dr. Perry's stuff and all that, I was like, I'm going to write a book on sensory processing because I'm not really thrilled with the ones that are out there. And, people need to know this better. Blah, blah, blah. And at that moment, I read Lindsay Beal's Raising a Sensory Smart Child. Right. And I was reading that book, and I rolled over at my husband, who was like half asleep. And I was like, well, there you go. And he was like, what do you mean? I said, I don't need to write a book. He goes, why? I said, Lindsay just wrote it. And he was like, okay. And then he rolled back over, I rolled over, and I didn't think about another, like I've never really wanted to be a writer. And so, but then Dr. Cross was saying, hey, we're going to redo this manual. We're going to call it the Notebook. We really want your input. And I do get frustrated when I'm invited to a conference or I'm invited to a thing, and they're like, here's your 30 minutes, talk about the sensory system.
Right.
And I'm like, that's so hard. Right. And that's one of my biggest frustrations I've always had with the Institute is I want to talk more. And I know we all do. I'm sure if you asked Kim or Sarah or, Scott or anybody, Darren, Amanda, we all are like, we need more time. And they're like, it's already a week long. You don't get any more time. And so, part of that was I wanted more time to write more things, because I was having a hard time knowing how deep, can you go deep in one area that you miss a lot of people, or do you go so broad that nobody gets specific? Yeah. And so, I was actually talking with Dr. Cross about it, and he said, he recommended, he goes, well, work on the notebook, and then the things you don't get to say, write a book about it. And I said, oh, okay. Like the Connected Parent had just come out. And he was like, yeah, like the Connected Parent. And so then he was like, and we'll publish it for you. And, he was mentioning all these things, which
Oh,
he didn't understand how, well, I'm sure he understood how it all, but it's, but somehow the translation got mixed to me. And so I wrote this book with all the things I wanted people to know for TBRI. Like I really wrote that for the TBRI audience and the NMT audience as well, because same thing, when I travel with Dr. Perry, then it's like, and here's Marty for an hour, and then he talks for the rest of the time. And so I thought, well, I could give this out at the lectures for those of these people. And it was really funny when I called Dr. Cross and I'm like, okay, it's ready. And he's like, oh, no, we can't do that for you. And I was like, what? Like, what do I do with this book? I'm not a writer. Like, I don't know anything about this. And then Cindy Lee was so gracious. And she was like, oh, I'm self-published. Let me help you work through that. And so literally awesome. Cindy Lee and I got on a Zoom and she was like, click that button. Okay, click that box. Okay, now you're set up. Publish your book. So that's kind of where, but I never wanted to be a writer. I never wanted to write that book. That was purely Dr. Cross. And that's why that's why he's in the foreword, because that was part of the deal is if I write this book, you have to do the foreword. And you have to give it credibility. So,
what do you feel like, during that process, obviously that writing process is intense. And what do you feel like were some of your big takeaways? Like, did you have any things that stood out to you as you were writing? Like that, man, I didn't realize I would emphasize so much on this, or this really stuck out to me. What do you think?
Again, I am going to struggle to answer that question because I am not a writer. And, I am faith-based, I do believe in, Jesus and all that. And I do feel like God really sat with me in that book. And the interesting thing about it is I wrote that book in 2 months. And I literally sat down and just wrote it because it was. And my husband kind of gave me the idea of just write it like you're giving a lecture. And that fit because that was what I wanted. I wanted more time as a lecturer. And that's what Dr. Cross told me to do. And so I sat down and was like, okay, if I would basically narrate my slides and the things that I teach people. And it was kind of a way for me, we had just brought my niece into the home and I knew that if I was going to teach about TBRI, I needed to live TBRI and that needed to come into my house at that time. And so I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of time for travel. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write this book and retire. And so this is really going to be like Dr. Cross can now give this out at the meetings and then I won't need to work anymore was my thought behind it. And so literally I sat down for 2 months and then God introduced me. I feel like it was a God thing. I started, another thing I wanted to do was equip more OTs in the trauma world. Yeah. And so I connected with a woman, another occupational therapist named Annie Chase, and she runs the Trauma Informed OT Facebook group. And then she wanted to launch the Alliance of Trauma Responsive OTs. And so I joined that as one of the founding people for that. And in that group, I met Holly Timberline, and Holly is a editor and an OT. And so she's a trauma focused OT who loves to edit books. And so by meeting her, I was like, Holly, make this book good. And she did. If I showed you my manuscript before Holly and after Holly, you would barely recognize it, because she would take it and she just made my words, she made them good, And so really when you ask me what was hard about it all, it wasn't hard. Like I just wrote it as a stream of conscience. I gave it to Holly. Holly edited it. It sounds amazing. I talked to Cindy Lee. She got it published for me, essentially, walked me through that process. So really it was just a collaboration of a lot of people coming together to make that book happen. And that's what's so cool about it. Right. And it really, it was a book that was written from my heart of, I wish I knew this as a parent. And so I want parents to know this with a side of focus on the sensory systems. Yeah. Sort of. Yeah.
That's really awesome. I'd love to kind of, I guess, shift gears, but kind of stay in the same thread when it comes to, you mentioned several times just discoveries you made as a parent, or if I'm going to teach TBRI and to live TBRI. Was that transition, how difficult was that for you? And did that inform your work and change your work at all as you began parenting that way?
Oh yes. let's just say I am a classic dismissive avoidant. So even if a kid in my room was crying, I was like, you're fine. Let's
Right.
just put some pressure on it. Move on. Like, I wasn't even compassionate in the therapy room, I don't think. And I wish I could go back and talk to some of my younger clients and be like, buddy, you just needed a minute.
Yeah.
You needed a minute. And I just threw you right back on that swing. And I'm so sorry, and then as a parent, especially with the parent with a kid, who I just saw as a straight up sensory lens, and I didn't understand that I needed to attach with her. So a lot of my early parenting strategies were, here, sit in this lycra bag, here, get on this swing. And I was doing sensory stuff, but there was very little connection with them. And so, that was what I learned with that. And I do remember there was a moment when my husband, with my niece who was living with us, and something happened, right? And I became really quite explosive, and he kind of looked at me and he goes, is this a TBRI moment? Something like that. And of course that made me even more mad, because I was like, those who can't do teach, okay? Like, I can't do this.
I mean, that's, I think everybody in the car right now is like, yes. Tell us more of those. Like, we've all had that. Like,
for sure.
As few days, right? Like,
yes. And I remember, but it did give me pause, and I was like, ugh. And he was like, what would you tell a TBRI person to do in this situation? And I was like, well, I'm going to give you some choice words first, and then I will come back to my cortex and give you some other ideas. But one of the things that really resonated with me, and I'm like, should I even share this story? Because it's not really like OT based, but phones are a big deal in our house. And we wanted to make sure that, phones stay in the living room. Like, that's just our family rule we've always had. And I had young kids in the house too. And so we wanted to set an example with my niece, who was a teenager. And so, but she kept taking her phone into her room. And of course I was like, you are not following the family rules. And, this is an easy one for you to follow. Like, all you need to do is plug it in out here. Like, just plug your phone in. And so we were having this big conversation, and my husband turned around and he was like, but if you think about it through the TBRI lens, this is her only connection to her past, and the only connection she has to the family that is out of state, that are the friends that are out of state that we've literally ripped her away from. And so I took that to heart, and I said, okay, so you're using this as protection. Like, this is safety for you. Your phone is safety. And I did look at the text. There was nothing going on. There was no inappropriate things. That was a non-negotiable as well. Like, I always have access to your phone. And she wasn't using it inappropriately, but she was texting late at night to connect with these people. And so when we realized that, I just sat down and had a conversation. I said, okay, I'm seeing your phone as a connection, and I'm seeing as you are using it to tie yourself to a past life that you're trying to move forward from. But I also understand you can't move quickly. And if this is helping you, stabilize while you're here, we're going to allow you to have your phone in your room. Like, we're going to give permission for that. And just when you're ready and you don't need this as a crutch, we would appreciate it if you put the phone in the living room. And it was 2 nights. 2 nights later, that phone was in the living room. And so that's probably one of my most powerful TBRI stories of leaning into, this goes against everything my thought of parenting, like, oh my gosh, I'm giving her phone. Like, but and it's been beautiful. And we've, I just, like you said, I just came back. She just had a baby, and I got to go see the baby today. And that's, I'm on cloud 9. He's adorable, and she's doing great. And like, TBRI worked for her. So. Yeah.
I think about that story in particular, and they're so entwined in parenting is this pride and I'm using
expectation,
like how we should do things, or don't let them push you around. Don't let them. And I think especially if you grow up in any kind of any kind of home where you're tethered to the church, there's expectations that come with that as well. And how you're taught in that particular church to parent bears out to. And so there's all these thoughts of making sure you draw strong lines and hard lines. And, you're not letting them push you around, and don't let them think they can just, weasel their way out of all this stuff. And in reality, when like what you're talking about, and this is a huge light bulb for us, when we can see what's actually happening in the brain and what's actually like seeing the needs behind these different behaviors, when you meet those needs, the actual compliance of this very small behavioral thing you're trying to address is almost a non-issue, right?
It is. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think about that in the same that, we've had different experiences with OT with some of our kids, and just I will never forget one of our OTs here. You met her, Luz, who is Wolf, is actually in Columbia right now teaching TBRI. She is amazing. But one of the things that she did is with our kids who were not in service at the time, she took them to the side and just taught them like, hey, when you, I'm trying not to share too much. So basically, like, here is how this seems to your sibling when this happened. This is where some of these explosions might be coming from. And it was within a week that you would see them as relatively small kids correcting themselves and all of a sudden giving massive amounts of grace when there are, outbursts happening or something's being thrown at them or whatever. And it was a very short period of time before they were they just needed small prompts and reminders to be able to then help support their sibling in this. And I think that bigger picture is kind of what you're talking about tapping into early with Dr. Perry's work, and then even now. And I wonder if there's something that you would like for parents to know, like with all that you're learning and hearing from other OTs around the country or even around the world, I guess. Are there some themes that you see that you wish parents kind of had, real simple, pieces of advice or frameworks as they're parenting?
Yeah, well, and I'll start out with, a lot of the literature on the limbic system and the insular cortex and, all these structures is really pretty new. And so to be learning about brain science and even the fMRI, which is where we get the functional magnetic resonance imaging or whatever, like to be able to like put your brain while you're awake and scan it and understand what structures are lighting up, right? That's within the last 10 to 20 years. So this science that we're learning about is so new that it's exploding, and that's really exciting. And so I've been an OT since the 90s. So a lot of this has happened in my career. And I went from, at the beginning of my career, nobody even knew what sensory processing was. Yeah. So when you're talking about what have been the aha and what wishing people knew and stuff, 20 years ago, I would say, I wish I could tell people that your child isn't crazy. They're not intentional. Like, sounds literally disrupt their nervous system. This food, their oral motor skills are not advanced enough. It's not about offering healthy, nutritious meals. They're not denying your love. They physically can't do this, And so I wished, like that compassion, but I feel like now that we're getting more brain-based, people are aware of sensory processing. They're aware of the diagnosis of autism. Like, all of that was new when I graduated. And so for me, it's this appreciation for, you're doing a podcast where I get to come on and be like, hey, most of your people already know about sensory processing disorders and challenges, and they understand that the tactile sense is a safety sense. And so they understand when their child doesn't wear certain clothes or they don't take baths or, then they're like, oh, it might be a tactile issue. And they know to seek us out as the occupational therapist to actually help you with that. And so for me, it's an appreciation that we've come so far in the last even 5 to 10 years. And I'm so excited with where we're going to go as well, because now that we know these structures, we're learning about something called interoception, which is how you feel internally that affects your external expression of your emotions. And so again, interoception was never mentioned when I was in school. And now we've got whole curriculums on it. And so I'm just so excited. And I encourage your listeners that if your child is doing something that you're like, that seems odd, like, I wonder why they do that, a Google search now will lead you down those paths into sensory processing. And I'm so grateful for that, because it really is, if there's one soapbox, is this kid is not doing this to be offensive to you personally. It is not personal. And that's the biggest thing I try and tell people. It is never personal. And I read a thing one time that talked about, it is harder to be them right now and experience it from their perspective than it is to be with them. And so just really, when a kid is really hard to be with, step back and be like, wow, if they're hard to be with, how hard is it within them to be within them?
Oh, that is a good reminder. Golly.
Yeah.
So along these last lines, or along the lines of what you just said, as we sort of kind of head for home here in this conversation, one of the things that I have kind of heard of you talking about some at different times, and that we've been able to have as clients of Memphis Family Connection Center and having incredible OTs here, is this idea of kind of debunking the need for ultra expensive sensory equipment to work with your kids in the house. And so we don't obviously have time to go through, every specific need that exists out there, but of some of the most common things that you're giving advice to parents to use or to hold, or there's some things that are being gouged in the market right now. Do you have any kind of, I guess, guides for a few of those simple things? Like, instead of, doing this, you can actually try this instead.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I have a whole book of those things. Like, so many things. Well, anyone that follows my work knows that I love Lycra, and Lycra is my favorite thing. And so just even a sheet of Lycra to wrap around yourself, and get that deep pressure, because really the proprioceptive sense is that calming sense. It's kind of that relationally, we get the deep touch through that. We get the compression through that. Like that's kind of our connecting sense, is that proprioceptive sense. So just a sheet of Lycra, or, a sheet of sweatshirt material, or something that you can just kind of wrap around yourself, could be really beneficial. I also use a lot of vibration, and a vibrating toothbrush is typically inexpensive, and especially a kid that is very has a lot of mouthing and things like that, and looking for things in their mouth. Bubblegum obviously is so easy and accessible. A cold drink with a straw is easy and accessible. I think one of my most creative and fun that a lot of your listeners won't use, but the two that will, they're going to thank me and they'll write in and be like, that was amazing. I cover a mattress with a satin sheet and sail it down the stairs. And that was like one of the best things I ever did. Yeah. If you don't have a slide in your house, you can, or cardboard and things like that. But we did, we just had a big mattress and we put satin sheets on it and we'd set it at the top, and the kids just hang on like monkeys, like they hold on, like in the Bogley, where they hang on real tight to like the fur, which would be the sheet. And they just sail down, and then they, slam into the wall. They get all that good crash and bump. But for those that don't want to do that, I would say have a good variety of things that are sour and sweet. And the mouth is one of the most regulatory places we can go easily. And the mouth is often nurture as well. And freezing things can change the texture and the taste. It actually can change the taste, because you don't have the sense of smell if nothing evaporates off of it. So, freezing things is a real easy way to go as well. And just don't underestimate the power of a walk outside. And just, if you're walking outside, change the direction of your walk, take your shoes off, add shoes on, walk in flip-flops or walk in snow boots in the middle of the summer, change up the things that you already have in the home for that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, those are such good suggestions. All right. I'm going to try to make notes of those and put them in the show notes for you guys. If you are listening and like, oh no, what'd you say? That's awesome. Marti, I hope you do know that if you've come on once, you now are obligated to come on with us a bunch of times in the future. And so,
and I'd be happy to go deeper into the senses and, talk about the last half of the book if you want. That does talk about like, how do we interact with these senses. And then we could go sense by sense, and I could give you those kinds of things in more depth. Because see, once again, I need more time, JD.
I know. I can't believe in 37 minutes you haven't gotten all that you wanted to say out. That's crazy.
Right? I know. So I just wrote a book. You want to know more? Read the book.
Well, I think I've got some schemes that I will not disclose to everyone listening right now, but yes, we would love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, we didn't really talk a whole lot about what I expected we would, but it was a good conversation. It was fun.
Awesome. Well, first of many, right?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So along those lines, Marti, if people are starting out work, and, we've talked on the show 1,000 times about, if you are thinking of services, just reach out. And it's easier said than done, obviously. So for people who are beginning that search for an OT and they're wanting to find someone who's trauma focused, how in the world do they differentiate between people who are general practicing OTs and are trauma aware, trauma informed, practicing OTs?
Yeah. The one of the biggest things I would say is how is the parent, how is the interaction with the parent? And if someone is going to be more trauma focused and trauma informed and trauma compassionate, they're going to include the parent more in the caregiving. When they make the goals, they're going to ask the parent, are these goals appropriate? They're going to say, does this feel right to you? Someone that is trauma focused is going to recognize that the parent really does know the child very well. There's going to be less ownership of the therapist in the clinic. When you're not trauma focused, there's a lot of the therapist knows what to do. They're going to do their thing and you don't have a lot of input. So
drop them off and let the pros do their work kind of thing.
Yeah, step back, let the pros do their work. Whereas if you're trauma based, you recognize there's probably attachment issues. And I, as much as I love that, my clients think I'm their best friend, I also recognize that it is way more important for me that they attach to the caregiver. And so I'm working really hard with that. I often let the parent come back into the session with me. And that's something to ask. Can I watch the sessions or can I be a part of it? Now, there are times when the child does best when the caregiver is not there, but it's in the interest of the child. Or, there are HIPAA rules where we can't always let you in the gym when there's other children. Right. But as much as we can, are we limiting your interactions because of other reasons, like valid reasons, or, is that just our policy? And so, as much as we can, I try and get the parent back with me. And I think that that's important if you're trauma aware. And just ask, are you a trauma focused therapist? Is there any have you had any trainings or anything? Because there's really no certification right now. We're kind of talking about it in the OT community and we're talking about those things, but there's no real label or certification. But you can ask, what kind of continuing education do you take? And if they're taking a lot of, orthopedic neuro continuing education, they may not be the best fit for you. And just asking them, what is your comfort level working with a child, who presents like mine or whatever. And see if they're open to even, I think if you're trauma informed, a lot of us value the information from the caregiver. So having a 20-minute consultation ahead of time, those of us that understand trauma are going to be pretty likely to say, yeah, that's important because I need to know where the child came from.
That's good. Yeah.
And I need to know what happened to them in order to help them heal from that, and those standardized evaluations are never going to give you enough space to write in the things that you need to tell us. So those are my things. What's the communication like? What's my involvement? And then, am I involved with the goals as well?
Well, a huge thank you for Marti for joining us and just great stuff from her, somebody that we will for sure be having on again and again and again. And so you need to, if you have not yet, go buy her book, The Connected Therapist. You can do so on Amazon, and I'm sure lots of other places as well, but do buy her book. She is awesome and somebody who's worth reading, especially if you have kiddos that struggle with sensory struggles at all. She is somebody who is a brilliant thinker on the topic. And so thank you to her. We are going to have tons of stuff this year for you on the ETC podcast. We've got an incredible lineup of all kinds of things, including some more series. We've got a bunch of different interviews with other new professionals and some that you have heard of before. And we will, again, of course, be going through our connecting practices and talking about all of that here in 2023. So we hope that you and yours had a happy New Year celebration the other night. We are hopeful that you will have a happy New Year this year altogether. And thank you for listening to the Empowered to Connect podcast. For everybody here at ETC, for Kyle Wright, who edits and engineers all of our audio, for Tad Jewett, the creator of the music behind the Empowered to Connect podcast, I'm JD Wilson, and we will see you next week on the Empowered to Connect podcast.